To welcome you all to round one of the round robin. I've been told to tell you guys that there is a POI rule, so you are expected to take 2 POIs. It will be considered to be a flaw in your speech if you do not take 2 POIs. That is the announcement that I have been told to give you. So
2 POIs per speech.
2 POIs per speech, yeah. So the other thing is that there is not, to my knowledge, no stated gender pronoun policy. So in absence of something of that policy, I've just asked that speakers try to use gender neutral language, be respectful, don't make assumptions. That would be generally pleasant of all of you. So without any further ado, call upon the Prime Minister to open up the round of debate. Here.
The timer's just gonna ding at 1, 6, 2, and 7. Yeah.
That's probably better anyway. What was that? I refer just do a joke. You're the first person to try to do it. Alright, honorable speakers. So what Tavish and I would say is that the way in which war is fought right now, when you're talking about total war or large-scale war, we think is oftentimes unjust, principally targets individual citizens within countries who are often the most disenfranchised, being poor or minority groups. So the way Tavish and I see it is that we think the reason why it's unfair is because of the way volunteer systems work and the way countries draft people. What Tavish and I would say is we require full draft, full lottery draft, random, entirely, when we're going to full-scale conflict. So what are we actually talking about to make the model very clear? So we're talking about when there's like a full invasion, so we're talking about levels like Vietnam or the World Wars or the Korean War or something that is very large scale for the United States to be engaging in. We're not letting people opt out for school or other reasons like that. We can say you can defer that and the government will provide you compensation to make sure that is possible, but we're saying we're not going to let people opt out for those types of reasons because we have problems with that. If you can't materially support the forces, then you don't have to be in the infantry, but you can support the army in some other manner. We pay them fair wages, and we're actively not letting people volunteer for these forces. The existing army will continue to go into the conflict, but the way in which we draft the remainder of the army is entirely by lottery and entirely random. 3 points I'm going to talk about.
Clarification.
Yeah, absolutely.
Will there be age selection or not?
Yeah, we'll preference people who are younger. No, actually, we're entirely random, so we're going to say, like, within the age up to you're, like, 40 years old and you can no longer fight. Past that, we're not going to draft people anymore because you're probably not useful in the fighting force anyway. 3 things I want to talk to you about. The first thing I'm going to talk to you about is a representative force, then I'm going to talk to you about ensuring just wars, lastly about legacy. First, a representative force. What is the problem that Tavish and I are actively trying to correct for in this debate? Recognize that when Vietnam was fought, the forces were disproportionately black and disproportionately poor. And the reasons why that were for a couple of things. The reasons were twofold. First of all, it allowed rich people to opt out, right? So requirements that if you were in school or you were going to university that meant that you did not have to enter into that conflict meant that rich people disproportionately got out of war and found loopholes in order to prevent themselves from having to enter into those types of conflicts by doing those types of means, right? So what that meant is that oftentimes because you still had to have a larger number of forces, you had to draft people who couldn't afford to go to university or couldn't afford those types of education, which disproportionately affected poor people. The second thing we would say is that even when you're talking about volunteering force and even when people seem like they're willingly volunteering, military campaigning disproportionately targets certain demographics, right? So the communities in which the military goes into to actively recruit people and the types of ads that the military puts out actively target black people or Hispanic people to try to recruit them into the military, and they're specifically done in poorer communities because the incentive is that these are the people who should fight these types of wars. So why do we think it's a particularly problem that these types of things happen? What's happening, I would say, and I don't think this is going to be a contention, is that war is a major harm to people who have to participate in it, is a major risk to their life. What we'd say is it's unfair, and what we think is happening under the status quo is a coercion of certain people to undertake these types of conflicts on behalf of the state in order to prevent other people who are often the most enfranchised from having to undertake those types of conflicts. So we think that what ends up happening is that some people get out of these types of situations and don't have to incur those types of harms in a way in which it is forced upon other people under the status quo, right? So what we'd say is that there's also social impacts to this and how you view other races or other people within society in terms of who should be fighting the conflict and who ought to be the next generation to undertake these types of conflicts. What Tavish and I would say is that this is particularly problematic for all these types of reasons. I'll take front half.
But there will be ways to, for example, get cushier jobs, cushier positions. Won't that be more likely to service those enfranchised in society to get those cushier positions?
So, like, realistically, we think, A, there's ways to model out that this would happen, but even if that were to happen, it's still better than the status quo where those people never have to engage in the conflict and stay back in the United States and never have to remotely be near a battlefield or see the types of suffering that other individuals face. For my second point, right, because I want to talk to you about just wars and why I think that's important. So now what we think happens is that everyone worries that they might have to fight the war, their family might have to fight the war, right? Recognize that right now, especially when you're talking about who has political power or social power within the United States, is oftentimes white rich people, right? Those are the types of people who are actively able to avoid the draft and have so avoided the draft going forward, right? The impacts of this and the reasons why we think this changes is because now people feel like they can't escape the draft, or there's a realistic chance that even if they are above the age limit or unlikely to get drafted, that someone in their family will get drafted or someone close to them will get drafted, right? We think that changes the calculus that politicians make when they're willing to engage in war. 4 impacts this. First of all, we think there's a higher bar to enter war. Recognize that if you fear that someone in your family might have to be in this type of conflict, then we think you are more likely to be critical of the types of harms that might occur on other people, right? Because you can empathize with the type of struggle that those soldiers will have to face insofar as you feel like it will affect you in some manner. So what Tavish and I would say is this leads to more just wars in terms of how you enter them, but the second impact of this would be we think that there's more calculus when you're wanting to prolong a conflict, right? Recognize that a lot of the reason why Vietnam was particularly bad is because it was continuously prolonged as a conflict, because there was constantly the next operation that had to be done. What we'd say is those types of things are taken more critically when it is your family on the battlefield, and the only way that happens for politicians is if you have a random lottery draft that ensures they don't have the ability to bypass the types of system that prevent them from having to undertake these actions right now, right? So the third thing I'd say to this is that you don't actively get people who hate the enemy, right? Recognize that in a system of volunteering, the types of people who volunteer are the ones who actively want to engage in that conflict. What Tavish and I would say is that's particularly problematic when you're talking about people who feel strongly about these types of things occurring, and especially when those become echo chambers for people who all feel the same way about an enemy. We say that's the type of situation which probably leads to war crimes, more likely under their side of the house or under the status quo. I'll take you in a second. The fourth thing we'd say to this is there's more incentive to give soldiers proper training, right? Recognize under status quo when people volunteer, it's like they have consented to that harm occurring to them. But at the point where it is someone in your family who might be fighting, or at the point at which it's like you feel like that person didn't have a say in that matter, you're more likely to give them the proper training, which they think they often need to be successful on the battlefield, to be more likely to survive, and lead to better wars. We think for all these reasons you end up getting more just wars in the terms of wars that are fought, and you also get better soldiers to ensure that the wars themselves are fought better. Sure.
If you have such a big problem with coercion, why is your policy explicitly coercing people randomly to join the military?
So what we'd say is the problem is that it disproportionately affects certain people under the status quo and pushes the majority of the burden onto certain groups within society, which Tavish and I would say are the most disenfranchised. What we'd say is, sure, some people are coerced who otherwise wouldn't want to fight the war. That is the reality, right? But we'd rather not have it be disproportionately minority groups or disproportionately poor people who have to bear that burden and then get worse off in the long run. Lastly, legacy of the war, right? Recognize that wars are viewed differently depending on how the wars are fought and the way in which it exists within the consciousness of people. So the legacy of World War II or the Korean War is one of like a unity fighting together against a common evil enemy in which the state was actively able to come together, whereas the legacy of the Vietnam War was one of like rich people sending black people to die in Vietnam or poor people to die in Vietnam against their will, right? The legacies exist differently for these wars because of the ways in which I talked to you about in my first and second point, people are drafted into these types of situations. So what we'd say is that like, because people can opt out for school or like rich people can move to Canada, which is the reality in the United States in the Vietnam War, people get out of these types of situations. That leads to the legacy of the war being affected negatively. What are the impacts of this? The first thing I'd say is that soldiers get treated better on return when it's viewed as a common war against a just war, right? And the reason why that is because the narrative is that these are heroes who came back from a conflict in which they were justly fighting on behalf of the state and deserve proper compensation in a way which doesn't exist for the wars under status quo. Secondly, I think you actually eliminate the ideas of the opponent in a way in which it's like you're fighting an ideology, not individuals, and I think that's really beneficial. For all these reasons, we propose.
I think that's your for the remarks and call upon the leader of the opposition to continue the round. Here.
I'm going to talk about three things today, most of them clashing directly with what we've heard from opening government. Firstly, about how we think that it leads to worse wars and like sort of worse political situation regarding when to go to war. Secondly, how we think that we get worse soldiers, and thirdly, why it inflicts individual harms on people that just simply isn't justified. First, a few points of rebuttal that isn't interval. So, first of all, they're talking about Vietnam in opening argument. What about Vietnam used a lottery system, right? They might argue it was an inferior lottery system because of certain, like, twinks they want to make to the system in terms of, like, not having student deferment, etc. But fundamentally, that's the model that they're proposing, right? We're not defending that on our side. Secondly, we said like the crux of their case is that this is something that poor minorities end up doing. I mean that is a bit like going at it the wrong way, right? Because what we have here is a situation where, for example, black people in the US might have worse access to education, and as such, they're more incentivized to say join the army in exchange for the army paying for their college. But the fundamental problem here, right, is the fact that they have worse access to education. We could fix that problem, that would probably be a good idea, but removing the tools that oppressed people have to deal with the structural injustice they're facing isn't doing them any favors. Because if people make conscious choices, being roughly pretty well aware that going to war is risky and might be dangerous, but I think it's worth it given the situation they have, given that there are no other venues, so for example, getting university education, I think that's a choice they should be allowed to make. And if you want to think that's like, a horrible situation for them, sure, we're willing to agree, but then maybe we should fix that situation, not remove the options that they have on the table. Finally, we said, the incentive to provide equipment for soldiers, we think is pretty good on either side of the house.
Yeah.
We think, the general idea of, giving your military the tools to do what you sent them out to do is both, egoistically, you have, because you want to win the war, that's why you entered the war, presumably, but also secondly, there's a lot of political pressure to provide for your troops. Similarly, again, veterans coming home are typically quite revered, especially in the US example that you talk about, right? There's a lot of political support to provide for those people, regardless of the system used to send them out. So going to my first point. So that when people in different layers of society get their kids drafted and could be killed or at risk of being killed, etc., they tell us that this is something that influences people. But that's probably right. You get a personal stake in the war. But we're not sure that that's a particularly good thing, right? Because people are quite irrational when it comes to their own children, to their own family. My willingness to sacrifice my kid for the best of the nation, the best of the world, is generally pretty low for most people. People are willing to prioritize their own families over almost anything else. That's what they want to provide, but we say that's not necessarily a good thing. That's something that makes people irrationally attached to the idea of peace, even in situations where going to war might actually be a good idea. I'll take a second.
Just to be clear, people are rational when they choose to go into war and choose to volunteer, but they're irrational when making decisions about peace?
We say that people are very much prioritize their own families in ways that might not be what society wants, right? So from society's perspective, a war might be good, but from my personal perspective, it might not be good if my kid dies. But the question is whether that's a good foundation for public policy. We say there isn't. So we say that there are some wars that are bad, there are some wars that are good. We think that bad wars typically happens despite of being bad, because there are powerful forces pushing for them, right? There might be a strong lobby group, there might be some kind of very strong overriding national interest, that means people enter wars when they shouldn't, such as the Vietnam War, such as the Iraq War, etc. So we said these wars are probably likely to happen anyway, but there are strong forces pushing for them. What we think of in terms of good wars is typically wars that are, for example, humanitarian interventions. Wars where the appeal to go to war comes as an appeal to altruism, as an appeal to your better self, for putting national, global interests above your own personal interests. We said that when you do that, but people have to weigh the risk of their kids dying, they're much less likely to be swayed by that. They're much less likely to step up and support humanitarian intervention in a country where they should. And we said that this happens on every level, right? It happens at the point where your kid gets drafted, but also happens as a risk you're taking before you go to war in the first place. So then we're likely to get, the bad wars are not as affected by this, but we're much less likely to get kind of good wars, to get humanitarian interventions that we do want. Secondly, thank you. So on our side, we have people who voluntarily opted into military service, right? Who sort of, on the comparative, are more aware of the risks they're taking, of the consequences of doing this. We think this leads to a couple of things. First of all, they're much more likely to better trained soldiers, better fit soldiers, right? Both in terms of, the skills they have, psychologically, physically, all those parameters, right? So we think that this is sort of, still means a better doing the job, right? It's going to be more effective force. Because we're going to do the quicker conclusions of war and less risk of sort of getting, bogged down in a quagmire, which means fewer casualties, better for the country in general. Again, Vietnam, I think, is a good example of where using the draft specifically led to by bad outcomes. But second under this, we say that you have better morale, right? Those who are forced will resent being forced. They'll be afraid. People who really, really don't want to be there. And this will mean that they're not going to be pretty incentivized to do a good job. This also spreads throughout the force, right? Even people who might want to do it, who might feel that they're drafted, they're doing their duty for the nation, whatever, they will know that people in their force aren't feeling that way. When you can't trust the people around you, that's quite detrimental to the discipline and the morale of the army as a whole, right? Especially when you have to make a sort of split-second, instantaneous decision you have to make on a battlefield, that becomes very hard to do and like in a much more less effective way when you can't trust people around you. Sure.
The problem that insofar as the military is supposed to represent the country, I think that it is a problem right now that only people who actively want to be in that conflict exist within the voices in those military camps. I think there ought to be some dissent or some diversity.
Okay, when we say it like that, dissent can happen in the political democratic discourse in the country. It doesn't happen to have within the army on the battlefield. I think that's not the place to have like discussions about public policy. Right? So when you have this kind of poor morale, when you have this bitterness, when you have this general sort of more likelihood of trauma because you're not prepared psychologically to be there, all of those things actually increase the risk of war crimes. So this specifically, if you look at, for example, the Vietnam War, these are some of the worst atrocities committed by US ground battle forces in a war, precisely because many people just didn't want to be there because there was a lot of bad morale in the armed forces, and that's precisely what leads to those kind of things. Right? Thirdly, then, individual harm. So we said that going to war is very costly for an individual, as government themselves point out. Right? There's a risk of death, there's injuries physically, mentally, permanent injury, loss of limbs, etc. And even in the best case scenario, where you come back home, untouched, you still lost a year or years of your life. You could have spent getting education, working, saving up, dating, starting a family, a bunch of stuff, right? You lose all of these things. And we think that important to know, this is potentially worth it if you think it's worth it. Right? Maybe you're a patriot and you want to go. Maybe you want to get the college education for free that you're getting. You might have your reasons if you're choosing to do it. Then it's not necessarily a bad thing. But if you're not choosing it, if you don't want to do this, these harms are quite severe. On our side, we're not really getting because people are choosing them voluntarily, based presumably on the way they weigh futility for themselves. But they impose this on people, ruin people's lives, less self-actualization, all that stuff. And this is unjust for the state to randomly impose this on law-abiding citizens who've done nothing to deserve, who've done nothing wrong, and taking all of these things away from them. We're very proud to oppose. Thank you.
And that's your remarks. Invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue this idea of case here.
Okay. Oh man, this is everybody ready? Okay. Panel? That was the joke, by the way, that I told what you made. So here's what we're gonna do. Refutation, one piece of constructive, and then rebuilding my partner's material. A lot of it was implicitly dealt with in the last speech. I want to explicitly show why his partner preempts or pre-refutes the ideas that were brought up by opening opposition in their first speech. Starting with some refutation, the first thing they bring up is that we have some level of confusion over Vietnam in the round. Perhaps they are confused about our example of Vietnam. Here's the stance on Vietnam that we're taking on side opening government. Vietnam was a system where there was a draft, but it was an imperfect system where it was easy to get out of the draft. The result was a lot of people who didn't have the power, social power that was necessary to get out of the draft went to the war. That wouldn't have happened on our side of the house, right? Recognize that when we make it only for volunteers, and when we ban volunteering, not at all for volunteers, and when it's compulsory that you're drafted, and when even if you're drafted, you have to serve in some level, or you have to help the military in some fashion. The wars like Vietnam don't happen because, as Mitchell points out, it's the moving target problem, right? It's because it's easy to sell to the voters that all we need to do is win this next battle, this next battle, this next battle, and it extends the conflict. That doesn't happen when everyone's voters' kids are in the war, right? We change the political incentives that are necessarily involved. It was an imperfect system. We do not defend that system. We're specifically taking a very bold stance that is against that system. We think it's bad. Okay, next thing they say is, they bring up, people can make their own choices. Yes, people can make their own choices. The question is, should we let them make their own choices, right? Recognize that a system that allows people to volunteer to go to conflict has impact on not only the army, but also on the conflict itself. So perhaps it makes sense for us to restrict this choice. But also, I would question the ability for people to actually have that free choice, right? Do you think that Latinos, for example, in the United States, who are told the only way you're going to be able to go to college or get some sort of level of training or job security is if you join the military and learn a trade, right? Is that really a free choice? Yes, they can make the choice to do that. That doesn't mean that it's like a respectful and honest choice on their part. Okay. But then, okay, now getting into, actually I'll take a POI now, because that was broad stuff. Ooh, who stood up first? I'll take back half first. I'll take you guys later though.
Look, very simple comparison here. On the one hand, a choice that is heavily influenced by advertising and financial pressure and the desire to go to university. On the other hand, a choice that is not a choice at all because it is conscription. If your problem is coercion, your solution is comparatively worse.
Well, it was certainly simple. Look, recognize that being coerced into do something is not just like, it's not just advertising and it's not just like society telling you you should go to university. We're talking about people's inability to feed their families and themselves and their fear of their fiscal future. So they join the military so they can practice a trade, so they can learn welding or they can be a nurse or something like that, and they can make money when they come back after the war. That's the gamble a lot of people make. Is that a free choice? No. Next. Okay, so that's a bold stance we're taking. Next thing they talk about is they're like, it's easy to outfit military troops in the status quo. This is refutation of my partner's point about how it's easier to actually support the troops. It is not at all easy to outfit the troops in the status quo. Being in favor of spending increases is like suicide, is like political suicide, especially in a deficit, which is often what the situation that you're in when you're in a war, right? Like recognize that in the times where, especially in American history, the times where America has honestly like pulled all together and coordinated itself towards a specific direct effort, it has been in times of war, right? And the result has been better outfitted people than would be able to have. Okay, next thing they say is, war would be very difficult to do. Yes, it's good, but war is very difficult to do. And they have this example of humanitarian interventions, and they say, oh, well, we wouldn't get any humanitarian interventions. Those are specifically left out of the motion, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a full-scale fundamental conflict between states where there's a full, like, on-scale invasion, right? That's the situation we want to engage with on our side of the house. That's what we think the debate is about. And in those situations, yes, it should be remarkably difficult, and it should certainly be more difficult than whatever counter position they're saying that they're advocating for inside opening opposition. Okay, next thing they talk about is that they get better soldiers. Why would they think that they get better soldiers? What makes a better soldier? This is the framework they didn't do in their speech. How does it affect a soldier's ability to effectively carry out his or her or their job in the military if they want to be there, right? Having a plan, having an idea of what war is going to be like and how you're going to conduct yourself means that you're not going to be as willing to pay attention to military procedures. Drafting is actually an effective way of creating a coordinated military unit because everyone brings into it nothing, right? They don't want to be there. That's the idea of drafting. Some people, yes, are hoping to get drafted, but the idea that you wouldn't have the super soldiers who are prepared and planned and they're really fit and stuff like that, that's good because those are the people that have their own ideas about what the conflict is. And that's when we bring in things like ethnocentrism and nationality and issues like that Mitchell talks about and why they're particularly bad. Okay. Last thing they talked about was like morale within like the divisions. Like trust between combatants is learned or gained in training, right? It's not based on your social situation. It's based on like going to a training camp, being in a battle or something like that. And to that level, I don't think morale is going to be that negatively affected. Also, just give everyone drugs. I don't know. Yeah.
Surely a bunch of people volunteering, choosing the same thing are much more likely to be aligned and working together than a random draw of people. Many people will be opposed to the war and not going to be there, much as likely to follow military procedure.
I don't think that's true. Firstly, because I think they're likely to be all working independently and recognize that in order to be successful in a military framework, you have to be following there is a broader plan, right? There are generals, there are people in charge who are setting up some level of structure and how you're supposed to operate. And yes, even if you really want to be there, you really want to let's invade that Iraq, bro, right? Even if you really want to do that, that doesn't mean you're going to be particularly good or effective at it for this, like in the eyes of the United States, who is conducting the conflict. Okay, on to one last point of like ideas, and then we'll go to a little bit of rebuilding. So the idea is more the bigger war here, right? Because recognize that the situations that the motion asks us to question are very rare, right? They're once or twice in a century situations when, as a nation, whatever nation we are forced to fundamentally confront another nation with a fundamentally different operating structure, right? This has only happened in the United States maybe twice, maybe with World War I and World War II, for example, right? So I think in these situations, it's remarkably important that when we are combating that idea, the idea realized into a state with the military, that we are doing so in the manner that Mitchell and I are talking about. Why is that true? Firstly, because I think it's really important that we combat this idea by being truly representative of the American people, right? It can't be viewed as all the white people went to Iraq to steal their oil kind of war, right? It has to be a fundamental, breakdown of Nazism, for example. And it's necessary in order for us to have a truly realized understanding of that idea that the military represents the entire country. But also we would say that it needs to be an effort that's larger than the army, right? And this is where Mitchell's political material and mechanisms become even more relevant, right? The fact that it would be more difficult to send an army into that situation makes sending that army into that situation all the more meaningful, right? And it means that back home, people are going to be supporting that effort. What it results in then is when we look back at conflicts like World War II, when we look back at conflicts like World War I, there is no ambiguity as to why we had this conflict, right? We know we were against a fundamental evil. That doesn't happen when you let people volunteer. That doesn't happen when you get rid of drafting for gratitude.
dispense your remarks, invite the deputy leader of the opposition to finish off the front half. Here.
I'm going to continue this case that Gustav started in his speech, that in 2 points. First of all, that it's fundamentally moral to view citizens as expendable instruments for killing, which is what they have on their side, which we don't have on our side. Secondly, we think that their system is not fair. Their main point is fairness. It's not fair. I'll point this out. But more than that, by promoting as at fair, they're creating this illusion of fairness. They're creating more harm on their side than our system that has also issues with fairness, but at least is tackling it and has opened with it. Before that, several points of rebuttal. First of all, they're saying that under their system, Vietnam won't happen at all, because apparently people still can't flee the country if you're rich. Like, even though accessibility is greater now than it was then, even though like all the privilege that existed in the 70s exists to an even greater extent now, in that inequality has increased as so. But we're talking about, when it comes to Vietnam as the problem of a conflict, we can look at, first of all, we talk about the atrocities committed by soldiers who were unmotivated because they didn't want to be there, who took drugs because they didn't want to be there, which they seem to promote on their side, but also because the government could easily say, let's go into this conflict because we have an access to soldiers, because we can force soldiers into this conflict. We don't have to actually pay for it with regards to any sort of incentive to get them to join willingly. And we think that being able to do so leads to the kind of conflict that Vietnam was. No, thank you. Specifically apply that to the kind of conflicts that won't happen. We talk about humanitarian interventions. They're saying that doesn't apply, but we're saying humanitarian interventions can be extensive military interventions, which is the motion, right? There's no need to say that humanitarian interventions must last for like 3 months. It might be to be able to be there, be a neutral sort of force on the field for years in order to keep two sides from massacring each other, for example. But the point is that there's no lobby or entrenched interest to promote this helping in this conflict, for example, on the national scene. There's no monetary interest to push politicians for voting for this. The only thing is a humanitarian aim. The problem here is that people might be like, yes, it is a noble thing, but since nobody's pushing me to do this, and because I might risk the health of my family, I will not do so. That is what Gustav gave you. They did not engage with that. Secondly, no, thank you. Secondly, what we're saying here is that they're saying it's so bad to have this fake choice, which we on both sides pointed out, that you will be forced into choosing the military in order to feed your family or get an education. We already point out the problem there is be able to feed your family, get an education. Because either on the side they say, we remove this choice, these families now can't feed their families at all, or they can't get an education at all, and that's a better to society under their side. Or they say, oh, we'll also provide great education and food to the poorest of our society. We say, well, can't we just do that first? And then they won't be subjected to this choice that they talk about, right? Secondly, they're saying, like, look, spending on military will be better on our side because we're more... because the politicians' sons might be in the army or whatever. What we're saying is that there's a political will to support military on both sides. And we've seen that the spending has increased to the military, in the US, even though they're running a deficit. But the crucial difference is on our side, we have an incentive to lure actual soldiers continuously. That means that if it comes out that we're not spending enough on military equipment, if that's the headline article of the Washington Post or the New York Times, then if I'm considering joining the military, I might think, well, they're not even giving these people, body armor, why should I join? That has a direct result on they're able to get people to join the military. On their side, they have no such incentive for the military to help out the spending, to do the kind of spending that sort of helps out the soldiers at large. So, lastly, they talk about better soldiers. We think, first of all, having more equipment makes you a better soldier, and we have that extra incentive, that's good. But secondly, we think that the main thing here, and this is their weird point about that, is that if you're willing to join, you're willing to go in there is a natural trust. There's also much more likely to be a unity within everyone there, right? Because you can trust your fellow soldiers. You also know that everyone's there for the reason to be there, to help out for patriotism or for what other reasons they want to be there. But on their side, they have people dragged in here, and they think that that's going to be better. They say that the people who want to be there might have independent thoughts of how to be a good soldier, and that might lead to bad cohesion. But if you look at any institution, if you have people dragged there who don't want to be there, that's terrible cohesion. Look at schools. Look at a public school that has to accept all students, even the ones who don't want to be in class at all. Compare that to a private school that can pick and choose and only get to take the top people who wish to be there. What has a better cohesion? What has better learning goals? What has better results? We think that it speaks for itself that when everyone wants to do their job, they'll be more likely to disassociate whatever independent thoughts or in that sense that will lead to discohesion and do it for the job. But if you don't want to be there at all, you can be equally as independent, but you're doing it in order to be destructive. I'll take closing.
Okay, so this picking and choosing of people who are in the military has allowed the military to actively exclude women and LGBTQ minorities from the military in the name of cohesion. Do you support that on your side of the house?
On our side of the house, we say that any kind of policies you wish to fix, we can also fix, right? We can also have, that let's not have discrimination in the military. We're fine with that. That is not what we're arguing here.
Yeah.
But secondly, let's talk about why it's fundamentally immoral. First of all, they're saying on their side, they have a right to call people up, to send them off to be killed or to kill. These are two of the most fundamental sort of impactful things on a human life, right? To kill somebody is something that has massive effect on your psyche. To be killed even more so, or to be potentially killed, right? We're saying that they're saying we're fine with the government taking citizens and forcing them into this choice. On our side, we don't say that's fine. We say that instead, society can choose if they should enter conflict or not. But they cannot force people to go there. They must incentivize them to do so. And that's how we do a lot of things. Like society wants people to collect garbage, but we don't force people to take them and do that job for like a crappy pay or under crappy conditions. No, we say, okay, so let's have a budget. Let's see who are willing to do this and under what circumstances. This should be applied to the military. If we're saying there's a conflict worth fighting, you should also provide the incentives for people to fight it, and we do so under our side. So they're saying, well, but ours is fair because anyone might be drafted, and look at that, the political realities. But all the privileges that they're talking about exist under their side as well. They're saying there will be exceptions on their sides. Who decides what exceptions there will be? Well, the politicians, right? The people in privilege, the people in position of powers. When will these exceptions be applied? Well, those in privilege will be more likely to be benefit from that. When you refuse, who will benefit? Well, those who can afford a lawyer, those who can afford to flee the country, or those who can say, I want the cushy position, and not everyone can get the cushy positions. Well, it will be the privilege to get that. An illusion of fairness is what they're pushing here. But in reality, which can also make you say that, look, we're all sacrificing even though on their side the privileged are still not. But on our side, we're saying, look, we give what people, the incentive people need in order to join this. We're not saying it's necessarily fair, but we're trying to make it as fair as possible. And that's why we win. Thank you.
Then as for the remarks, and I invite the member of government to open up the back half of the debate.
So in two constructive speeches and myriad POIs, all of OP has misunderstood the nature of coercion and the types of calculi that states engage in when they enter into extended conflicts. So I'm talking about two things. First, how this provision changes the wars we wage and how that functions as compared to what we get on side OP. And second, the kinds of conflicts that are prolonged when this provision is going to take place and why it affects warfare in a positive way. First, quite a bit of rebuttal. So first, opening opposition says that we can just fix education among poor and minority groups and not remove options that they have on the table. Firstly, he misunderstands the political and economic systems that make the improvement of education systems in inner cities and impoverished areas all but impossible. And so the fiat power that we're offering on-side government is not equivalent to what they say on theirs. But second, we think that he misunderstands some of the nuance that I'll bring you in my constructive. That the calculus of military now, wherein they need propaganda and coercive systems to gain soldiers, is gone under our side. Where the calculi of building these forces that they require in order to wage war is different, and that they are instead allocated to them in long-term conflicts. They have to cater to those groups that they are now serving in their military, and it changes the way that they act. Second, O says that the ability of soldiers is made less when they're civilians pulled from the general public. we say first that we use their own analysis from the leader when he says that both sides have an equal incentive to equip their soldiers to be the best. We need to draft systems in the status quo and long-term training systems allow for roughly equivalent systems of soldiers with equivalent proficiency, and that you can stagger the existence of civilians that are drafted with career military members. We think that's fine. The DLO says that this incentivizes countries to look for wars to wage when they have a draft force on hand. We think this is the worst characterization of the debate so far. On this, he misses the comparative, as we're not saying that Switzerland and Japan should have a draft tomorrow, but rather the states with enormous indoctrinated standing armies are made less harmful when they wage long-term war, because they now have to integrate a draft system that is by lottery rather than their standard of standing armies only, or their standard of drafting more pointedly. The DLO says that people will now only get income and that now only get income opportunity from the military don't have it, and this was very much liked by Michael. It now creates an incentive to promote benefits and opportunities for disenfranchised communities without the possible cost being their lives, and it saves them from the huge impact that the deputy brings us about the cost of killing someone and being told by your state that you must kill someone or face death yourself. We think that these costs are enormous, and they're situated on a particular group now that on our side they're not. On our side, change the calculus of how they function. Go ahead.
So maybe it gives incentives to help out these groups, but then on the other hand, there are these political and economic structures that someone might have misunderstood that might prevent it from happening anyway, right?
That's exactly right. And those structures are made worse when the best alternative for people living in poverty is to go to war and risk their lives. That's what we're bringing. All right, first, how this provision changes the wars we wage. Firstly, the warring body's actions are more likely to be dire and harmful in extended conflicts in particular. This lessens the incentive for them to engage in those dire actions. Why is this? Longer conflicts exert political pressure on those choosing to wage war, wherein they're compelled to do things that are more drastic to end the war sooner, right? So the longer a war gets, the more the political pressure says, you must end it now. What does this mean? This means that they take more drastic actions, wherein more and more they're willing to accept the loss of civilian life, the destruction of infrastructure, the bombing of cities, and more easily stomached by career soldiers that have been wholly indoctrinated by the system. So drafted civilians who still have training but are not buying in for the purposes of propaganda that dehumanizes the enemy and idolizes the project of government are better soldiers because they don't stomach the crimes that are being committed, right? Those that are integrated into those forces are more likely to have perspective that is not buying wholesale into the systems of that military. Second, these conflicts, if drawn out, are likely to continue in an insurmountable quagmire, and the best way for citizens to be compelled to look more closely at that conflict is if they have equal chance to be on the chopping block, right? So the best way to reduce the length of a conflict is to create an incentive for people to care. That incentive is greatest when you have an equal chance to be brought into that fight to look more closely at it. This means, as OG tells us, that we choose to opt in more carefully, but more importantly, and this is the analysis that Taylor and I will bring you, it puts in place a long-term system that requires a continued check, right? We think that right now, there isn't that check over a long period of time where you're in a conflict and you're trying to determine whether you should still be there, because the initial buy-in is the greatest barrier for you to do so. We think that right now, an initial war in Iraq, a conflict that isn't even designated as war by the government itself of the US, we think that that long-term conflict, when put in the circumstances of a draft measure at a certain point in time when it reaches extended, whatever that time might be, creates a new system of check in which the populace has to determine for itself whether this is a legitimate war, whether this is worth staking the lives of their citizens, and not only their citizens, but themselves, right? That they have an equal chance to buy into it. That this long-term check and this continued check, that it isn't just situated on those with the least political agency, is more likely to get better wars, and checks later in conflicts. I'll take back on. You got one? Oh, you're standing good? Go.
So, you say that drafting creates more pressure to end wars fast. Does pressure to end wars fast lead to more or less atrocities in wartime?
So this is the difference. You are less likely to have a force that's willing to stomach atrocities committed on their behalf when they are civilians drafted into that system. You instead, when you're trying to end wars quickly, we don't say that drafting creates an incentive to end wars quickly. We say extended conflicts create an incentive to end wars quickly, because the cost is greater the longer you're there. The likely outcomes are worse the longer you're there. And I'll talk about that right now in my construction. So, second, the kinds of conflicts that are prolonged. Firstly, is when the warring country has a vested economic or political interest in a given state. So these political or economic interests can be geopolitical, tugs of war, as happens through proxies in Syria, can be economic, as in Iraq, and offer huge benefits to political frameworks that are choosing to wage them without situating the cost on them. The second can be those that are more and more likely to end in an armistice, that have no good outcome possible. extended wars that undertake military backing from a group of people without the political capital to reject them are less likely to end, right? They're more likely to wage forever. So this is why the OO idea that this limits the ability to act to humanitarian ends is absurd. Humanitarian military action is seldom extended because the costs outweigh the benefits of that war. You're more likely to incur civilian harms, you're more likely to lose your own soldiers when it's extended. They haven't given us an example of an extended war that is for humanitarian ends because we say that there isn't one. So third, those that are far removed from the public eye and otherwise don't have a significant impact on them. On side op, these conflicts are able to proceed unimpeded for an extended time because they choose, or for as extended a time as they choose, with no mechanism to keep that length in check. All of these circumstances become money pits and are beneficial to capitalist governments that feel all of the benefits from this, geopolitical and economic, without feeling any of the harms. This proposition situates these harms on a group that can advocate politically and change the calculus that states engage in when they decide to go to war with very tragic results.
And that's here for the remarks, and I invite the opposition extension speaker to continue the round for side second off.
So the problem that Michael and I identify is that people care too much about the casualties in war. We pull out too early. We opt for drone strikes because when you force every single member of a civilian population to be personally invested in the harms, you don't get good wars, you get bad wars and significantly worse. That's why all the effects they talk about, making people feel the costs, are points for our side, right? So I'm going to extend on that. Firstly, why in the status quo we are already too unwilling to invest enough in war to ensure that these are good wars, and why the harms going to flow from these are immense. Before that, some rebuttal. Firstly, to the idea of coercion, right? They seem to believe that giving you strong reasons to do something equals coercing you. By this logic, we would ban all refugees from trying to flee to Europe or America because they have been coerced by evil genocidal forces like ISIS into coming in. The fact that you have good reasons for doing something does not make a decision bad, it just means you have good reasons for doing something. Now, presumably the analogy they're going to bring up is, well, it's like putting a gun to your head and saying your money or your life. It's not, because in that situation, what is immoral is that we have designed the situation such that the costs and benefits weigh in a certain way. It's bizarre to say, that the slave owners of the 18th century had the specific conscript policies of the status quo in mind when they decided to enslave black people. So none of that moral logic applies. You can basically forget all that stuff about coercion. But then they say there's a racial divide which exists, which you say, not an intrinsic harm. Most people who audition to play Martin Luther King also happen to be black. Not an intrinsic harm. They say, oh, the problem is we then view these lives as expendable because they're not white like the decision makers. Firstly, look, the fact that there exists a racial divide does not mean it's sold as a racial divide to the public, right? Which means that in terms of political discourse, you can't actually say it's fine, guys, because it's black people dying. The dominant discourse is these are Americans who are sacrificing their lives for us. See also, by the way, how people like John Kerry and John McCain tout their personal record in the military, how many sons of military veterans enter politics, and how white people themselves do feel significantly invested in war. So you can't say it's all a white person's game. And then he said, well, the problem is that, we only get people who actively want to be in a conflict fighting these things. To which we say that undermines all of your stuff about coercion, because presumably the people who sign up are the people who wanted to fight this war, then there's no coercion to begin with. Besides, we say, people don't sign up for specific wars. People sign up for the military. Conflicts happen, and then they fight for those conflicts. So that was more bizarre characterization from them. What did we hear from Extension? We heard that, well, if we have more civilians in war, less atrocities will happen. No. Because ordinary people commit horrific atrocities in wartime, not because they're intrinsically more bloodthirsty, because certain mental effects come into play in war. So one good example is moral boxing, right? A very good example is the My Lai massacre. Now, people who are kind, lovely people in real life decided to gun down pregnant women and children because they thought that in war, the usual moral and social metrics they apply simply didn't have relevance. No, thank you. Often it's because they de-agentify themselves. They say, I'm fighting on behalf of survival of my state, I'm nothing but an agent, so moral evil I commit does not apply to me. Often it's because of otherization. If the army is as good as propaganda, propaganda as you say it is, then people are not going to view people on the other side as genuinely, meaningfully human. In which case, ordinary civilians are still going to commit horrific crimes. Yes, go for it.
That was
Opening.
worse on your side of the house, where the recruiting process incentivizes the government to produce the propaganda that makes, for example, Vietnamese Americans into communists.
Look, I'm just saying that your benefits are marginal. I'm not about to go to the harms of your policy and why they're going to be huge, right? So yeah, I agree, this is partially mitigatory, but sometimes mitigation is a useful tactic in debating. So to be clear, the benefits from this side are actually pretty small. By the way, this no initial buy-in thing, if you generally are talking about big wars, like wars of survival, World War II style, either you already have the buy-in, in which case I don't see the difference, or if you don't have the buy-in, you risk losing, and then 6 million Jews die from genocide, right? So what's the context in which just no initial buy-in point applies? Because the own context your OG setup seems to harm you quite a lot. So let's talk about the harms of this policy right now. No, thank you. We tell you that we already currently care too much about casualties on our side, for a couple of reasons. One, currently, we view violence committed against brown bodies and white bodies quite differently, right? We think it's okay to withdraw from Mogadishu when 2 American soldiers die because they're part of our people and let the country burn for a long period of time. In war, no thank you, we are already biased towards overinflating the moral significance of our casualties and under-considering the harms which we cause to the countries which we are invading. And to be clear, even large-scale conflicts of big humanitarian dimensions, see World War II, comfort women, and a genocide against the Jews. Secondly, all wars nowadays are sold as short, quick, easy to mediate conflicts, right? It's partly, no thank you, a response to a couple of decades of bad wars which have been drawn up for too long, but the public is very skeptical about the capacity to engage in an extended war. That's why every single intervention which every liberal democracy sells to its people is, it's going to be short, it's going to be quick, we'll have a fast transition, right? No thank you. We also say populations are generally quite war-weary. So with this context, right, we generally like to pull out fast, we generally are skeptical of war. Why is it bad if we force everyday citizens to now see costs to their own children, their own sons? Firstly, it means that we either pull out too early or we do not intervene in wars to begin with. And this is a real problem. A good example is what happened in Mogadishu in 1993. I've gone through that, so I won't belabor this particular point. But secondly, no thank you, if it's true as you say, that white, rich, powerful people don't want their sons to die, it's not the case that they opt not to have the war, they just opt to have a war in which most of the strikes are air strikes or drone strikes, right? Because this minimizes the chances that their sons will be the ones underground. No thank you. Why is this morally problematic? Because when you do airstrikes from 30,000 feet, as Clinton did in Kosovo in 1999, you can't tell the difference between a civilian and a military target. When you do drone strikes, an Afghan wedding and a bunch of terrorists colluding starts to look awfully similar. But this is exactly what those powerful white people will do. Go for it, Cousin.
So you get long-term checks on things like the war in Iraq when you have a meaningful point at which the conflict is determined extended and now a mandatory random draft therefrom.
I'm not sure how that works, right? It appears to me that the dominant pressure now is to pull out of a war really fast, right? That's by far and away the most politically easy way to ensure that you are not subject to the political pressures of having to draft people over and over again against that war. This nicely leads me on to my third point about how we make wars worse. It's not just about drones and airstrikes, it's also what happens to militaries when they're forced to withdraw fast. Generally what we see is an attempt to end the conflict once and for all using a blitzkrieg of force. This is exactly what happened in Vietnam. So the pressures to use Agent Orange, Agent Yellow, were in large part created by the political awareness that we had to end this war now because it was so bloody and popular. So we had to flush the Viet Cong out at any possible cost to avoid telling our public that this was in fact a loss on the part of the American people. So if the most convenient get-out clause for the political powers that be is that we end this war right now, we don't have to do this unpopular draft. That's what you will see happening. You will see brown bodies, people who are non-American being sacrificed so that we have less body bags draped in the American flag being brought down by pallbearers from DC-50s. And that's why this is a terrible policy which we oppose in every way. I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank you for the remarks. Invite the government whip to finish off the government side of the debate. Here.
The member of opposition just told you that it's okay if poor minorities sign up more often to be in the military because the reasons they sign up are quote-unquote good reasons, and they are making a rational choice to do so. I think that we should abandon the idea in this debate that we can talk about war in a completely rational sense. It just doesn't happen. So any argument that is premised on complete rationality will fall at the point at which people are afraid for their lives. On government, we tell you that it is far better to have a system in which we make a choice about when we reevaluate conflict to see if it has truly been effective in achieving its ends, such that we are able to shorten conflicts that should be shortened and prolong conflicts that actually should be prolonged. When Danny tells you that on our side of the House, we get an actual reevaluation of the efficacy of military interventions, it is far better on our side of the House for whoever is involved. Okay, I have 3 questions to crystallize this debate, and then I have a couple points of rebuttal that I'm going to start with just so we can get them off the table. But the questions that we're going to talk about are 1, how does this change the nature of conflicts? 2, how does it impact the efficacy of military interventions? And 3, we'll settle the question of, are we more or less likely to engage in extended conflict on the government side of the House? But a few points of rebuttal. So first, to opening opposition, when they tell you things like the military is going to be far less effective on our side of the House, we think that we get a less effective military on opposition when the kinds of people that are elected to be in the military and buy in to the military mental calculus that says it's okay to kill all of these people because as a country, they are the enemy. It's how you get American sniper Chris Kyle thinking that every single Muslim that he sees is necessarily a target. You get that on opposition when people aren't forced to make a choice about the efficacy of a conflict when they go in, and when the public isn't forced to reconcile their politics with the conflict that the public is engaging in. But also, we think that to closing opposition, when they tell you that people don't sign up for specific wars, we actually wish that they would. Right? We actually wish that people actually had to think, not about whether the military as an institution is good, because we think that most countries probably need a military. But when there is a draft at the point of an extended conflict, we think that the public has to evaluate whether or not the specific war that they are engaging in is good, and whether or not they want to push for a political impetus to end that war faster. And now we're going to deal with this conflict that apparently closing opposition sees in ending wars more quickly, because what we think happens on our side of the House is that people are more likely to understand the humanitarian costs of war when it is not simply people who volunteered to go who have their lives at risk, right? The government is more likely to understand the risks of war when they know that the general public is at risk of dying if they extend the conflict. Okay, but first, I'll take opening actually, yeah.
The availability of soldiers to the army can either be because they can manipulate the political discourse or because they can improve the benefits and incentives for soldiers to join. Why is your side more boring?
Okay, so we think when they improve the benefits for soldiers to join, they necessarily manipulate disenfranchised populations to feel as if the military is their best option for social and political gains. We think this is bad because it coerces a group of people into joining in the military only because they think it is their only option, right? We think this is bad. But also we think that when those militaries publicize and advertise for their conflict, when they say go army, because we think that this will make you a better moral person in society, they're also coercing people into saying that they're not evaluating the efficacy of a specific war or conflict, but they're evaluating how they feel about themselves in society. Okay, how does this change the nature of conflict? So one, we think that it does create less incentive for dire actions, because invading countries are more likely to engage in morally reprehensible action when the military personnel have bought in wholesale into the politics of the military, right? When you have people in the military who have been drafted and actually might object to the practices of the military, it is far less likely that you would be able to engage in effective dire actions. It is far more likely that you would have to choose an effective but also more humanitarian method of conducting war, because it is far more easy to get people who don't want to be in the military to buy into a humanitarian way of dealing with a conflict. But also we think that the whole population is held accountable, right? Because on opposition side of the House, when they say that the volunteers, in a minute, when volunteers are the people who we've brought in, it means that the whole population isn't accountable, right? The only people who are accountable for the acts of war are the people who have volunteered to be in war. Now, every single person in a society is accountable for the way in which war is conducted, because it is very likely they could be in the war themselves. Back up.
A lot of your analysis is premised on the idea that governments like to enter full-scale World War II type wars. Can you justify why this is the case?
Okay, so Danny talked about this a little bit. We can talk about it more, right? We think that governments like to enter full-scale war because it actually has a lot of economic benefits for them, right? There's a lot of money to be made for producers in your country if you've engaged in full-scale war, right? Producing tanks is an expensive and like GDP-raising thing to do, right? Actually, there's huge economic benefits to being in a war, right? But we think that when the calculus that you have to make is more about human life, you're far more likely to put your resources into humanitarian interventions in which the public can support, as opposed to interventions that are purely for economic or political gains, simply because you see that there's an economic benefit to be garnered from that intervention. But also we think, how does this impact the efficacy of military interventions, right? Because mission creep happens when there lacks a check on the military itself, right? It is far more likely that you're able to continue to reevaluate your goals in a conflict if nobody is telling you that there is a specific point at which you have to decide whether or not you're going to stay in or pull out, right? And this cause for reevaluation becomes the drafting point, right? When we've decided this is a full-scale conflict, we need to make a real calculation about whether or not we want to be in that conflict itself, right? So it means that it's far less likely that you're going to have mission creep continuing to happen over decades because you engage in a point at which the military must decide whether or not this is the kind of thing that they would want to incur a draft on the entire country for, or if it's something that we should stop doing because it isn't going to have the efficacy that we want. It means we engage in more effective conflicts, or we have a more effective plan of action. But ultimately, how does this deal with, are we more or less likely to engage in conflict? What it means is that when you have this reevaluation of conflicts, that at the point at which their conflict could be extended for economic or political means, you're going to have a check on that, right? That not every conflict will be extended past that point. It means you're going to have some shorter conflicts because you're able to deal with the short-term harms that you wanted to deal with, and then you're going to pull out because we don't think it is necessarily always better to be engaged in a long-term conflict. There's a lot of harm for the country that you invade when you do that. So ultimately, because the costs of engaging in a long-term conflict are much higher, the burden of proof for why we should be there is much higher, we think we're far less likely to engage in those conflicts because we put the entire population at risk, and that is the calculation we should be making when we go to war.
Ministry for the remarks, invite the opposition whip to finish off the debate in its entirety. Here. Do you want us to wait for your partner?
No, he's a bit sick. So
Okay, sure. Just want to make sure. So whenever you're ready.
So, the basis of the government case in this debate is when you have universal randomized conscription, you better evaluate the cost of war. But this rests on a very narrow definition of cost. It is the cost to you, to your country, to your citizens, in their blood. But what they're missing is that that is the component of the decision-making process that is already overemphasized. Countries are all too willing to tot up the costs of benefit of war in their own blood and their own treasure, but are all too reticent about thinking about the lives of people who live in a different place, who speak a different language, but have the very same humanity. 3 things in this speech. 1, are wars prosecuted in a better way? Hint, they're not. Secondly, do we go to war in better or worse cases? I think there's a slight bias to go to war in better cases on our side of the House, but I think the overwhelming majority of this debate is one in that first point. Finally, are people coerced, and more generally, what does that word mean? Because I think there's been some confusion about that on the government bench. So, let me just revisit briefly, an argumentative amuse-bouche, if you will, the government's case. They said war will be fought better for 2 reasons. First off, because the bar gets higher, and secondly, because you don't prolong wars. Well, these arguments rest on 2 pretty obvious premises, neither of which they proved. 1, that the bar is currently too low. They did nothing whatsoever to prove that, other than lazy references to Iraq and ethnic minorities, but no systematic general argument at all. And then secondly, they said, well, the second premise is that wars are too short. Again, no justification of that premise whatsoever, other than the assumption that, the wars are too long at the moment, other than, again, lazy references to Iraq. I'm going to explain to you, and Ashish explains in his extension, why both of those premises are false, and why actually both of those points work for our side. So, why is it the case on their side that people pull out earlier? And they give you the analysis for this. Now they phrase it in very aspirational terms. They say, people perceive the costs and benefits of war much better. Again, I've already pointed out this very narrow definition of costs and benefits, but I also want to point out that contradicts the very first words that came out of Taylor's mouth when she said, people can't think rationally about war. Okay, you can't have your cake and eat it. Either people think rationally about war, or they don't think rationally about war, but either way, they can't be not thinking rationally about war, but accurately perceiving the costs and benefits, which is the basis of your extension. So that was a pretty clumsy knife there. Maybe they should join the military. So, why is it the case that people pull out earlier on their side of the house? Two reasons. Firstly, as they point out, the war is at first sold as going to be short. That means when it becomes long, the electorate become pretty antsy and start protesting pretty rapidly. That means as a politician, you have a very strong incentive to make good on your word and maintain the people's trust by pulling out, irrespective of the strategic situation on the ground. Secondly, the costs of continuing the war rise politically because everyone's kids are involved. That is the premise of their case. So why is this bad? Well, big picture, currently, we misperceive the costs and benefits of war. We think about the costs in terms of the lives of our citizens and our troops, as opposed to thinking about the costs in terms of the actual humanity that is lost. So, on their side of the house, they exacerbate the aspect that is already pushing out to pull out too early. Why is that the case? Because it's very quick for costs to mount up for our troops. It doesn't take long before lots of Americans start dying in Iraq. But what does take a long time is providing some degree of safety and security for the Iraqi people, of taking them from a country that was a rampaging dictatorship to a country where there is some degree of democratic consensus and peace. That's the bit that takes time. So this skewed perception of costs and benefits means that you pull out too early, and all they do is skew it even more. What are the concrete harms of this? One, there are a large number of humanitarian disasters that they can't prevent. Secondly, you get grotesque instability in the country in question because it often takes, no thanks, a long occupation to build stability. And I just want to point this out because they've rested a lot on the example of Iraq here. Iraq is the best example for our side. You pull out in 2012 when the generals told Obama it was not time to pull out. 3 years later, what do you see? The rise of the most bloodthirsty ethnic insurgency of the last 20 years, namely the Islamic State. That is the precise example that best bulwarks a case. You pull out too early before you are able to maintain peace. Thirdly, you conduct war in a way that removes your troops from the ground, which also removes the discretion that enables you to avoid civilian casualties. Think drones. Think bombing from 30,000 feet in Serbia in former Yugoslavia. Fourthly, use a shock and awe tactic to create temporary peace when you leave. Think the invasion of Cambodia and Laos before Nixon pulled out the troops in Vietnam. Closing.
So if that incentive to avoid war is so overinflated in the status quo, why do we have so many conflicts waged explicitly for the political and economic interests of war?
Fantastic. For the very simple reason that you remember the conflicts that happen, and in particular the conflicts that didn't go well for you, because bear in mind the costs are borne in your troops, but the benefits are borne by someone else. But you don't remember the conflicts that don't happen, for the very simple reason that they don't happen. So there's a cognitive bias here that you are relying on that is unpersuasive. So, why is it that we go into too few conflicts? Because, as Ashish points out, there is a grotesque gap of moral feeling between people who look like you, people who speak your language, people who share your culture and your country, and people who are other from that, people who don't live in that country, who don't share those values, whom you are unwilling to risk your life and your treasure for. What does this mean? It means there are a huge number of conflicts where people went in far too late or didn't go in at all. Think about Rwanda. Think about the Second World War, where the US waited until 1941 when 2.5 million Jews had already gone to the gas chamber before intervening, in spite of the fact that FDR knew perfectly well what was going on. That is the reality of today's debate, and that is the reality that they only bulwark by increasing costs on precisely the wrong dimension. So finally, are people making choices? First and foremost, I just want to point out the comparative here is literal coercion. So even if you believe that people are exerting a modicum of autonomy, we win this comparative. Point one, I think openly do a pretty good job at pointing out that we don't have to stand for things like the DREAM Act and the very worst cases of coercion, the same way they don't have to stand for poorly executed drafts like in Vietnam. But secondly, Ashish really turns this point on our head by explaining that the choices where you have a very strong incentive to make that choice are the choices that matter the most, right? Their world is a world that only protects and validates choices that are evenly matched. But those are the choices where you'd be roughly the same if you took either option. No, the choices we ought to protect are precisely the asymmetric ones, the ones where people feel a huge burden. Now, maybe we'd believe that this was so asymmetric it was coercive if every black person and minority member felt the urge to join the military. But the numbers are still like 5% among those demographics, so it's just unclear that it meets the bar of coercion that they're claiming it does. But finally, they knife this when they make the argument that this army attracts specifically bloodlusty people. Okay, well if people are choosing to go in because of their bloodlust, they're hardly being coerced, are they, guys? At the end of this debate, they didn't know what they stood for. What they were actually standing for was the continuing whitewash of conflict. We're proud to stand against that. Thank you very much.
Thank all the speakers for the remarks.